Hi everyone, my name is Tobias Mattei. I'm the Deputy Editor of the North American Spine Society Journal, and I have the pleasure of having with me today here Dr. Saifi, who's the senior author of an article entitled The Language of All Medical Publications and Spine Publications from 1950 to 2020, an article that was recently published at NASSJ. So welcome. And would you be able to give us a brief introduction of your practice, location, affiliation, your main fields of interest, and maybe some of your research in the past?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. It's a wonderful opportunity. I'm Comron Saifi, as you mentioned. I practice at Houston Methodist Hospital in Houston, Texas. And I am specialized in spine surgery specifically. I do a good bit of minimally invasive spine surgery, both for degenerative as well as deformity. I also take care of open spinal deformity and spinal oncology. In terms of research interests, we have a few areas that my research team is focusing on down here at Houston Methodist. One area of interest is functional outcomes that we're starting to look at in terms of patient objective functional metrics before and after surgery, so we can compare not only subjective patient-reported outcomes, but also objective findings. So some examples of this are we have portable force plates in our clinic where we can have a patient do a squat to stand or just a closed eye stance, and we can generate quite a bit of data on how much strength they have, and we use this data to track them objectively over time after surgery. Another area that we are currently actively involved in is with the Terabali lab here, which is one of our research labs looking at cancer research. We're looking at metastatic spine cancer research, specifically in the lab with their team, providing them with samples. And we're using a technology that was actually really developed and perfected for COVID vaccines, the liposomal transfer. We're using that to transfer our chemotherapy. And then lastly, the last area we've done a lot of research and we continue to do so is social determinants of health. So we've partnered with some of the folks at University of Houston who've done a fantastic job at social determinants of health, and we're working with them to figure out interventions and ways to help our patients who have challenges that are outside of the hospital, limiting their medical care.
Perfect. You seem to have a very busy research team spanning a broad areas of interest. So I was very interested in this article you published, both because of the magnitude of the data you collected. It's almost 30 million publications spanning almost 70 years. And first, would you be able to tell us the importance of the subject? I think we can all have an idea of how meaningful it is to at least know, not only have an idea of the language of publications, how they currently are, but especially how that's been evolving in the past few decades. But if you want to please highlight some of the unanswered questions in the literature and how you believe that your methodology could find the answers for those questions, and the sequence, of course, we're discussing some of the implications of your findings and what it means for future research.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's, I think it's an interesting topic because, obviously, when we think outside of our own borders, spine surgery, and when we go to conferences, particularly, SRS and IMAS that have an international presence, CSRS and NASS as well. There's an international presence there. And so we have people from all over the world who take care of patients with spinal pathology. And so their communication is obviously critical. And so when we looked at these papers, we looked to see what languages are people publishing in. And obviously, if, if there isn't an easy way to translate, then that data, that those results and those studies get siloed based on the language. And so I think it's critical that we are able to share information across, all languages and countries. Some of the things that we found that were rather interesting is if we had a figure in our publication that if you looked, I think around 1960 or so, about half the publications in spine were non-English and half were English. So, it was 50-50 back in 1960. And over that period of time, now it's nearly all English. I mean, there's just a few percentage of non-English manuscripts. And this, there's a lot of ways to look at this, but that's the data that we found. One interesting, when we substratified by non-English languages, we did find that while all the other languages decreased, Chinese papers from China and in Chinese increased significantly, particularly after 2000, around 2000 or so. They increased and they peaked around 2013. And while they've gone down a little bit, they're still the percentage of publications in Chinese is much more than any other language. And I think that really speaks to the investment that they've made in research, and that extends to spine surgery research as well.
And one of the findings that also caught my attention was the finding that I think there was Chinese, that you have a significant increase in the publications in Chinese throughout that period, but also of publications in Portuguese, almost 400%, and in Spanish. And I'm originally from Latin America, and I remember several of the journals which are actually indexed on PubMed. They have the abstracts in English, but they are written in Portuguese. And I mean, if you ask why that would be the case, I clearly understand, and I think every researcher is aware that there will be significant limitations in terms of the impact that type of publication would have. But at the same time, especially epidemiological studies, I mean, I can see several of the studies publishing in the national journals there. I think they're mainly tailored to the national pool of spine surgeons in the region. And I do think that the impact, at least for older generation of the spine surgeons, may be higher if that's published in a local language, a national language, rather than in English. And I'm curious if you find any other possible reasons why this trend continues. I think it's something cultural, and I'm a little bit reticent in terms of calling this lost research. I mean, the fact is that language barriers it's a natural issue that we've been dealing for the history of mankind, and previous attempts to come up with some neutral grounds such as Esperanto or things like that, they have never reached such a success. And especially in the scientific field, I mean, English became de facto the universal language. But I can see, especially in terms of the whole geopolitical international scenario with China, and the very fact that people maybe have some, I mean, there's still cultural ties and other reasons why some researchers may prefer to have a broader national audience rather than reaching an audience for whom that research may be less meaningful. But I don't know if you have any other explanation for this increase. I specifically noticed the Chinese as well as the whole Latin American context. Still having a significant increase. Yeah.
Yes, that's very true. And I agree with your points. I think it depends on who your target audience is. And so, it would be, I think, eventually it would be ideal if, when a paper is published, it's published or accessible it could be translated in any language, because I think the goal would be to, not just, obviously, on some aspect, we want to reach as many as possible, but at the other aspect, maybe as you mentioned, maybe your target audience is as you mentioned, an older generation of surgeons in your country or whichever country that is, and you want to reach them with your manuscript. I think it makes sense then to do the manuscript in that language. I think also, just as Latin America and China, are some of these areas are just increasing their research, and it's more of a reflection of increased percentage of research and not necessarily a change in the percentage of publications in the language from there. So for instance, we see that, like China, for instance, they had a tremendous increase in just the overall total output of publications. And so some of those publications are just published in Chinese or Mandarin. And so that is reflective upon an underlying increase in research funding and research interest in those regions. And that's one possibility that reflects in more papers in those languages. But also, I think it depends on on which audience you're trying to target. And so I think that it's important to be able to, have this accessible and create systems to have it accessible to, the local language of the country it's being published in, but also internationally. And so, obviously that's challenging to do, but would be ideal in the future so that there is more sharing, not just internationally, but locally as well.
And that ties a little bit to your methodology. I remember when I first saw this, it was not that surprising. I would expect the vast majority of the publications, at least in the current era, to be in English. But one of the things that I noticed is that you query PubMed and you were looking for publications in other languages. And I remember when I did my medical school in Brazil that a lot of the top publications and most of the well-respected journals, they would have the abstracting in English, they would be indexed on PubMed, and then the full text would be available only in Portuguese. But there was also a meaningful number of journals, some state medical journals and other really interesting publications, of course, with a lower impact. And they were indexed, for example, only in Cielo, which is the citation index in Latin America. And there are other ones that, like, I think there's a Korea citation index, there's a Chinese science citation database. So I wonder, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I have the impression that perhaps the results of your study, because it focused exclusively on PubMed, it may even underestimate the amount of publications in other languages. I think that maybe even higher because we're possibly ignoring those non-PubMed index articles, journals which are indexing in their local database.
100% agree with you on that point. So this is limited to PubMed. So this is only a reflection of PubMed and not reflection of anything broader. And so that is certainly the case. And again, that's another limitation, not only of the study, but of our, daily practices as well. I mean, I would say that I personally, when I do a literature search, it's, either PubMed or Google Scholar, or our team will do a combination. And I think that's an important point that you bring up, that we are, I think, de facto or by default limiting ourselves to those indexes or databases, and we are probably missing out on important research that we may be looking for. That's in, a different one of the other databases, medical databases. I think familiarity is a big part of it. Training is a big part of it. In my training, that's, how we were trained. But I think we should bring attention to these other, languages, databases, and understanding of where, there may be really good data and science that maybe we don't normally access.
And you mentioned in one portion of the article about how the barrier may be bidirectional, in the sense that, when you publish in a non-English language, you ended up limiting, that there's some limitations for those English-only speakers. And the same way, English-only publications are limitations for those who don't speak English. But I would point out that I think the main limitation when you publish in a non-English language is not only about English people that don't speak the other language. You're basically limiting to all of the other countries for which English is not the primary language, but neither is Chinese, for example. So when there's a publication in Chinese, it's not only that you're limiting some of American or English people that don't speak Chinese. The fact that you're isolating possibly a significant portion of Latin America, to whom English is the only universal language or common point of contact between the Chinese community and the Latin American community. And I think that accounts for most of those. I personally have found throughout some of my research several publications that I was very interested in. I remember when I clicked, it was some European language I was not familiar with, and unfortunately I had access only to the abstract. So I think that definitely plays a role in terms of the limitations, and that's why you see that even other countries which have a very strong cultural background, such as Japan. Even in Japan, you see a massive decline in the publications purely in Japanese in favor of publications in English. Not that much, because I think at some point in the article you mentioned that people are interested in making English the universal language. I think it's more about having an universal language than any specific affection to the English. The fact that that's the way science progresses, and it's very hard to go against the tide. So what are the main takes away of this study? This is somewhat expected. The whole historical evolution, I think it's a little bit less expected. I was not aware, for example, that even in the mid-20th century, almost half of the publications were not in English. So I was not expecting that exponential growth to be that sharp and so meaningful throughout the second half of the 20th century. But what are the main takes away of this study, and what do you think are the implications for the future of research, especially regarding this increase in the publications, for example, in Chinese, in Portuguese and Spanish, and how do you personally expect that to progress in the next few years?
So I think I agree with you. It doesn't matter the language, the specific language. It's just a common denominator by which we can communicate data, study results, publications by. And so, as you mentioned, that has obviously become English, particularly over the last several decades, at a pretty rapid pace. But there are exceptions to those. And again, this is only within PubMed. So it'd be very interesting to see. And I think it's a little bit of a related but separate topic, in that, data can be siloed if, people are using, say, the Korean citation index or the Arabic, the other ones that you mentioned, the Chinese science citation, obviously those are going to be more populated with the local language. And I do think that is also kind of a related theme in terms of how data can get, studies can get siloed. I think, my hope is that while it's been challenging in the past, that technology has advanced, particularly with translational services, where even, now free services like Google Translate are, while they're not completely accurate, they've improved immensely. And I think, not now, but in the future, a hope would be that that progression continues. And so that, you download a publication in any language, and you can automatically have it translated to your local language. And obviously the challenge is there are nuances with language and nuances with science and scientific language. And so the real challenge is going to be preserving those nuances so that the studies don't lose their originally intended meaning. And so I think that's obviously a very challenging technological feat, but I do think that will happen eventually. Obviously, the question is when, and I think that will be a very, very great thing for all of us. Where you could publish in any language and just have it translated, and I think that would be the ultimate goal for sharing data. And I think also, trying to integrate these different international publication databases, while maintaining the similar quality of peer review, I think is also something that we should be aware of and work towards, so that we can, really exchange knowledge more freely.
And I think a very interesting question that it's kind of somewhat interrelated, but it was not the specific target of your study, because you basically look at almost like an overview of the percentage of the publications in English and non-English. But when I ask myself what are the implications of that, one thing that I was very curious, and I think future studies may be designed to address that specific question, is to compare the impact factor of publications, for example, from Chinese groups published in English and in Chinese. I mean, naturally, we would expect that the impact would be higher for the English publications, but to be honest, I'm not quite sure. I mean, it may well be the case that there are some publications in Chinese that they may have, on average, much higher impact factor. Of course, not outside China, but because of what we discussed, they reach such a large group of researchers in China who are specifically focused on that line of research, especially if it's something related to basic science. So it's not only about the language of the publications, but I would say an interesting question for future studies to answer is, what are the implications of deciding to publish in your own language and in English in terms of the impact of that research?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's an interesting question. I think also, kind of what you're driving at is what is the impact, and we often use the impact factor as a metric for that, but that's obviously one piece of the pie for an impact of a study. How does that impact other institutions versus institutions in China? If or in Latin America, for instance, if someone in Brazil publishes in Portuguese, is that going to have a stronger impact on the local scientific community versus or will it have a larger impact globally if they publish in a different language? So I think these are great questions. I think impact factor is one piece of that puzzle, but obviously it's highly dependent on the number of readers, the number of people who are involved, and so it's not necessarily a clear-cut surrogate marker for the importance of a study. But it would be interesting to see what the different impacts are of these, and I think ultimately try to help, bridge this gap. I think, and not having to decide in the future to have, sort of a universal system, or even have two versions of a publication where it be one in say the country, the native language, and one in English or any other considered universal language, just for reach of audience. And I think, hopefully in the future, we'll have more access and not less. And I think that would be interesting to see what the different impact is, as you mentioned, based on the choice of language. And a great, study for any journal would be to look at, what if you publish, two versions and track them in terms of impact factor, right? Because then you take the variables out and you have that's a nice study on its own, right? To publish both in the native language as well as in English and see how those, how that impacts the local environment or community versus the international. And that would give you a sense of how they really compare while, comparing apples to apples. So I think there's a lot of interesting things that can be done. I think the importance is to bring attention to this topic, which I think is not normally, discussed, particularly for those of us such as myself, where, we're always just PubMed and we do, English only. And so just being aware that, there's a lot of great research out there that we need to probably make a little bit more effort to be aware of. And I think that's true not only for individual researchers, but for journals as well.
And I think your point is well made that the impact factor in terms of subsequent citations is only one piece of the puzzle. And I can clearly see, for example, if there's a guideline for treatment of osteoporotic fracture published by the Chinese Spine Society, the main interest would be to reach the whole spine society in the country. So if you would choose any language, I don't think English would be the initial language. And I think your idea about the whole analogy with Google Translator and the hope that we would be able to access, for example, the NASSJ website and be able to choose the language we want to download. It's a great prospect for the future. I just question myself, who would bear the burden of paying for that type of service? Because I just cannot see how this would be automatically done. So it would have to be article by article. And then, even though in terms of the publisher, I don't think the publishers would be willing to have a whole editorial team to translate the articles. Yeah. So I think it would fall more on the authors that, for example, NASSJ would offer the option of publishing your paper in English and a version in Chinese, and then the authors would submit both and have both available. But that in some sense would also limit to maybe one or two language, right? And wouldn't be that widespread 10 language that you could there pick and choose and everyone could read in their native language.
Yeah, no, I think probably a short-term idea is what you just mentioned, where the authors have the option of submitting in, say, their native language in addition to English. A long-term thought is even now you can upload a document to Google Translate and it will translate it, but obviously quality is the issue at this point. And I think, if that quality improves, and a lot of the technology, takes a while, but once that improves, then potentially you could have an automated system where, you click, you pick the language and you download it in that language. The challenge is maintaining the quality through any automated translational service. And I think we're obviously not there from a technological standpoint, but hopefully in the future we will be, and I think that'll open up a lot of as we say, cross-pollination between different groups and previously areas where we may not have shared publications and data.
Yeah, and I think it goes to the fact that I believe most spine surgeons worldwide, they are able to read in English, but I cannot deny that. It's somewhat odd, and I remember that happening with me, for example, if I'm presenting a lecture in Brazil, where I came from. And of course, the National Congress is in Portuguese, so I'm there presenting Portuguese. And then I present an article in English there, and I want to discuss the abstract. And on the go, I have to translate the whole odds ratio to what I remember to be those statistical terms in Portuguese, because I'm actually speaking in Portuguese, and I don't want to shift half in English, half in Portuguese. So I think it's a matter of, especially when you're dealing in the environment, in the local environment, you want to have that available rather than having to switch from one language to another. Usually it's not a big deal, but it's something that at least sounds weird and odd when you start reading something in the language and translating yourself during the presentation. So I can definitely see how that would benefit.
I agree with you. And then I think the other thing, and you kind of alluded to, is when you're at these conferences, if you're folks who do research internationally, all, for the most part, the ones that I've met, they speak multiple languages, including English. And so, but when you get on the ground to the private practice in any country, I'm sure the percentage is probably going to be lower of those who speak English than the researchers. And so, you want to be able to, at a conference in any country, be able to provide that in a way that is, their most comfortable communication style. And I think that's also an important ability if you're in that setting that you described, that you communicated in a way that people are most comfortable.
For sure. And thank you very much for your time. It was a very interesting discussion. Anything else you would like to highlight regarding your research or some of the findings?
No, I think that was really comprehensive. I appreciate your time. I think, the NASS journal is really been, the evolution has been very nice to see. And we certainly are very grateful that, our paper was accepted and published. And I think, NASS as a whole, I'm involved in the spine committees for deformity oncology, is really kind of pushing the forefront of a lot of avenues. And I'm just glad to see that the publication is taking off and doing well.
Especially taking account our international focus and the worldwide audience that we want to reach. I'm very happy that this study was published in our journal. And I thank you very much for all your efforts and your research team. And again, the breadth of the study, spanning more than 70 years with 30 million publication, is really breathtaking, and I'm sure it's going to be a landmark for future similar studies on the issue. So thank you very much.
Thank you.